Who's the odd one out? He'd point at old pictures. At 10, I didn't get the game. Everyone in the photos was a stranger to me. Yesterday, going through the archive, I saw it. One person appeared in every photo, wearing clothes from different eras, with my face. My hands were shaking as I stared at the collection spread across my kitchen table. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. These weren't just random family photos my brother had been obsessing over for years. They were evidence of something impossible, something that made my skin crawl and my heart race. The first photo was sepia-toned, clearly from the 1800s. A man in a Victorian suit stood beside a woman in a bustle dress. But his face, God, his face was exactly mine. Same nose, same eyes, same slight dimple in the chin that I'd inherited and always thought was unique to me. The next photo was from what looked like the 1920s, showing a group of people at what appeared to be a jazz club. There he was again, wearing a pinstripe suit and suspenders, that familiar face staring back at me with the same intensity one saw in mirrors. Photo after photo, decade after decade, the pattern continued. The 1940s showed him in military uniform. The 1960s captured him at what looked like a wedding, wearing a simple black suit. The 1980s version had him in casual clothes at what appeared to be a backyard barbecue. But it wasn't just the resemblance, it was exact. Like someone had photoshopped my face onto these historical figures. I remember being 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on our living room carpet while my older brother pulled out these same photos. He'd always been weird about them, treating them like sacred artifacts. He'd make me study each one for hours, asking me to find what was different, what didn't belong. I never understood what he wanted me to see. Back then, I just thought they were boring old pictures of dead relatives I'd never met. My brother had this intensity when he'd show me the photos. His eyes would get this strange gleam, and he'd watch my face carefully as I looked at each image. Sometimes he'd seem disappointed when I'd shrug and say I couldn't find anything unusual. Other times, he'd seem relieved. I never knew which reaction meant what, but I could tell the whole thing was incredibly important to him in a way I couldn't grasp. As I grew older, the photo sessions became less frequent but never stopped entirely. Even as a teenager, he'd occasionally pull out the collection during family gatherings or quiet evenings at home. He'd still ask me to look for differences, but by then I'd grown tired of the game and would usually just glance at them half-heartedly before making up some excuse to leave. Now, 20 years later, staring at these images with adult eyes and a mind capable of recognizing patterns, the truth was undeniable and terrifying. Every single photo contained the same face, my face, spanning over a century of family history. My brother had moved out years ago after a falling out with our parents. We barely spoke anymore, just occasional holiday visits and awkward phone calls. But he'd left behind boxes of his stuff in our parents' basement, and yesterday I'd finally decided to go through them while they were out of town. Most of it was typical brother stuff, old video games, school papers, sports trophies. But then I found the photo collection, carefully preserved in acid-free folders and organized by decade. The basement suddenly felt too small, too dark. I gathered up all the photos and brought them upstairs to the kitchen where the lighting was better. That's when I really saw it. Under the bright fluorescent lights, there was no denying what I was looking at. The face was identical in every single photograph. Not similar, identical. The same bone structure, the same expression, even the same tiny scar above the left eyebrow that I'd gotten falling off my bike when I was 7. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank my brother had been planning for years. Maybe he'd somehow doctored these photos using computer software, though some of them looked authentically aged and showed signs of being genuine vintage prints. Maybe it was just an incredible family resemblance that I'd never noticed before because I'd been too young to recognize my own features in others. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations felt right. There was something else going on here, something that made my stomach churn with dread. I spent the rest of the day researching our family history online, digging through genealogy websites and death records. What I found made everything worse. The dates matched up perfectly. Every person in those photos had lived during the time periods their clothing suggested. They all had different names, different occupations, different life stories. But according to the records, they were all direct male descendants in our family line, and they had all died at exactly the same age, 28. I'm 27. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to look at the photos again, hoping I'd been mistaken, hoping the resemblance would seem less exact in different lighting or when I was less tired. But it never did. If anything, the longer I stared, the more convinced I became that I was looking at the same person over and over again, somehow existing across different time periods. I tried calling my brother, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking him to call me back, trying to keep my voice calm and normal. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I needed answers. He was the only one who might be able to explain what I was seeing. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, daylight made everything seem more real and more terrifying. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the collection of photographs spread out before me. Each face stared back with my own eyes, creating a gallery of impossible mirror images stretching back through time. That's when I remembered my brother's journal. Update 1. I found it in the last box I hadn't gone through yet, hidden beneath a stack of old comic books. The leather cover was worn and cracked, filled with my brother's familiar handwriting. Most of the entries were mundane, complaints about school, notes about girls he liked, typical teenage stuff. But scattered throughout were entries that made my blood run cold. The earliest relevant entry was dated 15 years ago, when I was 12 and he was 16. He'd written about watching me look at the photos, about how I was getting closer to understanding but wasn't there yet. He described feeling relieved each time I failed to see what he called the pattern, but also worried about what would happen when I inevitably did. According to his journal, our family carried what he called the repetition. Every few generations, a male child would be born who was an exact genetic copy of an ancestor from the 1600s. These copies weren't just similar, they were identical down to the cellular level, sharing not just appearance but memories, personality traits, even scars and injuries from the original's life. The journal described how these repetitions would live normal lives until they became aware of their true nature, usually around age 28. Once they realized what they were, something would awaken in them, not just their own consciousness, but the consciousness of every repetition who had come before. They would remember lives they'd never lived, experience deaths they'd never died, and gradually lose their sense of individual identity as they merged with their previous incarnations. But here's where it got truly horrifying. The journal claimed that when one repetition awakened, it created a disturbance that could potentially wake up all the others. The dead repetitions, buried in graves scattered across the country, would begin to stir. Not physically rising from their graves like some cheesy zombie movie, but experiencing a form of consciousness that allowed them to reach out across time and space. My brother had written extensively about his research into our family history. He tracked down records going back centuries, finding documentation of male descendants who had lived and died in a pattern that exactly matched what I discovered in my own research. Every single one had died at 28, often under mysterious or sudden circumstances. Heart attacks, accidents, unexplained illnesses, always something that couldn't be easily explained but didn't raise too many questions. According to the journal, I was the 12th repetition. The original had been born in 1634 and had died in 1662 under circumstances that were heavily documented in local church records. He'd been accused of witchcraft after neighbors reported seeing him in multiple places at the same time, speaking with voices of the dead and demonstrating knowledge of events that had happened before his birth. My brother had been watching me my entire life, looking for signs that I was beginning to awaken. The photo game had been his way of testing my awareness, seeing if I could recognize the pattern that would trigger my transformation. Every time I failed to see it, he gained more time to figure out how to prevent what he believed was inevitable. The final entries in the journal were the most disturbing. My brother had become convinced that there was no way to stop the awakening once it began, but he'd been desperately searching for ways to delay it or minimize its impact. He consulted with historians, genealogists, even people who claimed to have experience with supernatural phenomena. Most had dismissed him as delusional, but a few had taken his story seriously enough to offer advice. One entry, dated just 3 years ago, described a conversation with an elderly woman who claimed her family had dealt with a similar curse generations earlier. She told him that the only way to break the cycle was for the current repetition to choose death before awakening, essentially sacrificing himself to prevent the others from stirring. But she'd also warned that if he waited too long, if the awakening process had already begun, voluntary death wouldn't be enough. The woman had given him specific signs to watch for that would indicate the awakening was starting. Changes in sleep patterns, sudden knowledge of historical events he'd never studied, dreams featuring people and places from past eras, and most significantly, contact from the previous repetitions themselves. My hands were trembling as I read that last part, because I'd been experiencing strange dreams for the past several months. Dreams where I was wearing clothes from different time periods, living in houses I'd never seen, interacting with people I'd never met but somehow knew intimately. I dismissed them as stress from work and changes in my life, but now they took on a sinister new meaning. The journal's final entry was dated just 6 months ago. My brother had written that he believed my awakening was imminent and that he couldn't bear to watch it happen. He decided to disappear, hoping that his absence might somehow delay or prevent the process. His last words were a desperate apology and a plea that I would forgive him for the burden he was leaving me to face alone. I sat in my kitchen for hours after reading the journal, trying to process everything I'd learned. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as the delusions of a troubled mind, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. The photos, the genealogical records, the pattern of deaths, everything aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. As the day wore on, I found myself studying my reflection in mirrors and windows, looking for signs of change. Did my eyes seem different? Did I feel different? It was impossible to tell if what I was experiencing was real transformation or just the power of suggestion working on an already stressed mind. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to run from what I was learning, I decided to embrace it. If I really was part of some supernatural family legacy, I wanted to understand it fully. I spent the night researching everything I could find about our ancestor from the 1600s, reading historical records and trying to piece together the original story. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying, but it was nothing compared to what happened the next morning. Update 2. I woke up to find 11 letters scattered across my front porch, each one addressed to me in different handwriting. The envelopes were all different too. Some looked modern, others appeared aged and yellowed as if they'd been sitting in storage for decades. But what made my heart stop was the postmarks. The letters were dated from years spanning over a century: 1823, 1891, 1927, 1954, 1967, 1973, 1981, 1995, 2001, 2015, and 2019. Each envelope contained a single sheet of paper with the same message written in different hands. We are waiting. My rational mind tried to find logical explanations. Maybe this was an elaborate prank someone had been planning for months or years. Maybe my brother had arranged for these letters to be delivered as part of some twisted psychological experiment. But the postmarks looked genuine, and some of the papers showed real signs of age that would be difficult to fake convincingly. More disturbing than the letters themselves was how they'd appeared. I lived in a secure apartment building with locked entrances and mailboxes. There was no way someone could have just scattered letters on my doorstep without being seen by neighbors or caught on the building's security cameras. Yet there they were, arranged in a neat row as if they'd been carefully placed by invisible hands. I brought the letters inside and spread them out on my kitchen table next to the photographs and journal. The dates corresponded exactly with the death years of the family members I'd identified in my research. It was as if each repetition had somehow managed to send me a message from beyond death, all arriving at the exact moment when I was ready to receive them. The handwriting in each letter was different, but there were similarities that couldn't be ignored. Certain letter formations, the way periods were placed, the overall slant and pressure of the writing, they all shared characteristics with my own handwriting. It was like looking at variations of my own penmanship across different time periods and life experiences. As I studied the letters more closely, I began to notice other details that made the situation even more surreal. The paper in the older letters wasn't just aged, it was the exact type of stationery that would have been common during those time periods. The ink had the chemical composition and fading patterns consistent with writing instruments from different eras. Even the postal stamps, when I examined them under a magnifying glass, appeared to be genuine vintage specimens worth significant money to collectors. The implications were staggering. Either someone had spent enormous amounts of time and money creating an incredibly elaborate hoax, or I was actually receiving messages from deceased family members who had somehow retained enough consciousness after death to reach out across time. That afternoon, something even stranger happened. I was sitting at my computer, trying to research more about our family history, when I suddenly found myself typing information I'd never learned. Dates, names, locations, specific details about events that had happened in the 1700s and 1800s, all flowing from my fingers onto the screen as if I was remembering things I'd experienced personally. I wrote about a farm in Pennsylvania where one of my previous incarnations had lived, describing the layout of buildings, the names of neighbors, even the specific breed of cattle that had been raised there. I wrote about a factory job in Detroit during the 1920s, detailing working conditions, supervisor names, and labor disputes with an accuracy that seemed impossible for someone who'd never studied that period of history. The writing felt automatic, like my conscious mind was just observing while some other part of me controlled my hands. The information poured out for hours, filling dozens of pages with historical details that I somehow knew were accurate even though I had no way of verifying most of them. When the automatic writing finally stopped, I was exhausted and disoriented. It felt like I'd been dreaming while awake, experiencing memories that belonged to someone else but felt completely real and personal. The boundary between my own identity and these historical figures was starting to blur in ways that frightened me. That night, the dreams became more intense and vivid than ever before. I experienced entire lifetimes in a single night's sleep, living through births, childhoods, careers, relationships, and deaths of people who looked exactly like me but lived in different centuries. Each dream was so detailed and emotionally rich that waking up felt like dying, losing entire lives and identities that had become as real to me as my own memories. During one particularly vivid dream, I was working as a blacksmith in colonial America. I could feel the heat of the forge on my face, smell the smoke and hot metal, hear the rhythm of hammer strikes on anvil. I knew the names of my customers, understood the techniques for working different types of metal, felt the satisfaction of creating useful tools and implements. When I woke up, my hands actually ached as if I'd been gripping heavy tools for hours. Another dream placed me in the trenches of World War I, experiencing the terror and camaraderie of soldiers facing impossible odds. I could taste the mud, feel the concussion of artillery shells, hear the desperate prayers of men who knew they might not survive the next charge. The emotional weight of that experience lingered for hours after waking, leaving me with a deep sadness for a war I'd never fought in and comrades I'd never met. The most disturbing aspect of these dreams wasn't their vividness, but how natural they felt. Each life seemed as real and valid as my current existence. I began to question which version of myself was actually real, or if maybe they all were equally real in some way I couldn't understand. During my waking hours, I started experiencing what I can only describe as memory bleeds. I'd be going about my normal routine when suddenly I'd remember something that had never happened to me, a conversation with a woman from the 1800s, the taste of food that hadn't been available for decades, the feeling of wearing clothing styles that had been out of fashion for generations. These memory bleeds became more frequent and intense as the days passed. Sometimes I'd catch myself speaking in speech patterns from different eras, using words and phrases that felt natural but were completely out of place in modern conversation. I'd find myself craving foods I'd never eaten, humming melodies I'd never heard, and knowing the solutions to historical problems I'd never studied. The boundary between past and present was dissolving, and I was beginning to understand what my brother's journal had warned about. The awakening wasn't just about remembering previous lives, it was about all those lives becoming active simultaneously within my consciousness. I wasn't just one person anymore. I was becoming a collection of identities spanning centuries. But the most terrifying realization came when I understood that this process was irreversible and accelerating. Each day brought stronger connections to my previous incarnations, and I could feel my original personality becoming just one voice among many in an increasingly crowded mental space. The letters had said they were waiting, but I was beginning to understand that they weren't waiting for me to join them, they were waiting for me to become them. Final update. The awakening reached its peak on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, but ended with me understanding the true horror of my family's curse. I woke up with complete memories of 11 previous lifetimes, each as clear and detailed as my own 27 years of experience. But more than that, I could feel the presence of each previous incarnation as a separate consciousness within my mind. They weren't just memories anymore. They were active, aware entities sharing my mental space. I could hear their voices, feel their emotions, experience their individual personalities as distinct from my own. It was like hosting a constant internal conference call with 11 other versions of myself, each one bringing their own perspectives, knowledge, and desires. The original personality from 1634 was the strongest presence. He carried the weight of centuries and understood our condition in ways the others couldn't. Through his memories, I learned the truth about our family's curse. We weren't actually genetic copies. We were fragments of his soul, reincarnated again and again in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. The original had made a deal with something ancient and malevolent, trading his natural death for the promise of immortality. But the entity he bargained with had twisted his wish, condemning him to live the same life over and over while retaining memories of each previous iteration. Each death brought him back in a new body with a new identity, but always with the same face, the same essential nature, and eventually the same awakening to his true situation. The curse had one particularly cruel aspect. Each awakening didn't just restore the memories of previous lives, it also created a psychic connection that could potentially resurrect the consciousness of every previous incarnation. The dead bodies remained in their graves, but their minds could be pulled back into the world of the living, existing as spiritual parasites feeding off the life force of the current incarnation. As the day progressed, I felt my own personality becoming weaker while the historical voices grew stronger. They began taking control of my actions for increasing periods of time. I'd find myself walking to locations I'd never been before, but that felt familiar to previous incarnations. I'd start conversations with strangers using knowledge and social customs from different eras. My reflection in mirrors began showing subtle changes, different expressions, postures, and mannerisms that belonged to other lifetimes. The most disturbing development was when the voices started disagreeing with each other and with me. The incarnation from the 1920s wanted to seek out jazz clubs and speakeasies that no longer existed. The World War II version insisted we needed to report to a military base for duty. The 1960s personality craved drugs and experiences that would have been dangerous for someone unprepared for their effects. Managing 11 different sets of desires, fears, and compulsions while trying to maintain my own identity became increasingly impossible. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of competing consciousness, losing my sense of self in the chaos of multiple lifetimes demanding attention simultaneously. But then something unexpected happened that changed everything. I discovered that one of the previous incarnations, the one from 1995, had found a way to break the cycle. Unlike the others, his memories included knowledge of the curse and a plan he'd developed to end it permanently. He'd spent years researching occult methods and had identified a ritual that could sever the spiritual connections binding us together across time. The ritual required the current incarnation to willingly sacrifice not just his own life, but his spiritual essence, completely destroying the soul fragment that kept reincarnating. It was a form of suicide that went beyond physical death, erasing the very possibility of future rebirths by consuming the spiritual energy that fueled the curse. According to his research, performing this ritual during the awakening process would also release all the previous incarnations from their spiritual bondage, allowing them to finally move on to whatever comes after death instead of being trapped in endless cycles of resurrection. The decision I faced was horrible but clear. I could let the awakening continue, losing my individual identity as I became a collection of historical personalities, eventually dying at 28 only to be reborn again in another generation. Or I could perform the ritual, ending not just my own existence but the entire cursed bloodline. What made the choice even more difficult was that I'd started receiving visits from the previous incarnations. Not just their voices in my head, but actual manifestations of their spiritual forms. They appeared in my apartment at all hours, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, all of them pleading with me to make different choices. Some begged me to perform the ritual, describing the torment of being pulled back from death again and again, never being allowed to rest in peace. Others insisted I should embrace the awakening, arguing that our collective consciousness represented a form of immortality that shouldn't be wasted. A few tried to convince me that we could find ways to coexist peacefully, sharing control of our shared existence. These visits weren't hallucinations or dreams. The spirits could interact with physical objects, leaving evidence of their presence that I could document and verify. They knew things about the world that I didn't, could access information from their respective time periods, and displayed personalities and knowledge that were clearly distinct from my own thoughts and imagination. The apartment became crowded with ghostly figures from different eras, each one desperate to influence my decision. The cacophony of voices, both internal and external, made it impossible to think clearly or find any peace. I was living in a supernatural nightmare where past and present collided in ways that challenged everything I thought I knew about life, death, and identity. As my 28th birthday approached, I knew I was running out of time. The awakening process was accelerating, and soon I would lose the ability to make any conscious choice at all. The ritual had to be performed while I still retained enough individual identity to act independently of the other personalities. I spent my final days preparing, following the detailed instructions left by the 1995 incarnation. The ritual required specific materials, precise timing, and an absolute commitment to seeing it through regardless of the spiritual and emotional pressure from the other personalities. On the night before my birthday, I performed the ritual in my apartment, surrounded by the ghostly forms of my previous incarnations. Some watched silently, others wept, a few tried to physically interfere. But I persevered, speaking the words that would end our shared existence forever. The process was more painful than I'd anticipated, not just physically but spiritually. I felt parts of my soul being torn away and consumed, experienced the death agonies of every previous incarnation simultaneously, and faced the complete dissolution of everything I'd ever been or might become. But as the ritual reached its climax, something beautiful happened. The spiritual forms of my previous incarnations began to fade, but not in anguish or terror. They looked peaceful, grateful, finally free from the curse that had bound them for centuries. Each one thanked me as they disappeared, moving on to whatever awaited them beyond the cycle of forced reincarnation. The last to go was the original from 1634, who had carried the burden of our curse for so long. He looked at me with eyes that held centuries of sorrow and regret, but also hope and gratitude. His final words were an apology for the burden he'd created and a blessing for the sacrifice I was making to end it. As I write this, I can feel my own life force fading. The ritual is working, and soon I'll join the others in whatever comes after this existence. But I'm not afraid anymore. Instead of being trapped in an endless cycle of death and rebirth, I'm choosing to end the story on my own terms. The photos are burning in my fireplace, the letters are scattered and dissolving, and the journal will be destroyed along with everything else when this apartment is cleaned out after my death. The cursed bloodline dies with me, and no future generation will have to face the horror of awakening to memories they never lived and voices they never chose to hear. If anyone finds this account after I'm gone, know that I faced this choice willingly and without regret. Sometimes the only way to truly live is to choose how and when to die, breaking cycles that would otherwise continue forever. The curse ends here, and I'm finally free.